shared. Okay, so you should get a message that I'm being recorded. Lovely. So welcome everybody. You've come today to listen to our webinar about loss, bereavement and change, in particular in relation to the coronavirus situation. So although, you know, we potentially in a different time, we would have all been sitting in a room together talking about this content, and many of us have before. We've delivered this training in your schools, and if any of you have done the ELSA training, you will have had a half-day training on this content. So you'll recognise a lot of the content, which we hope will be reassuring. But what we're doing today is talking about how this is relevant in particular in relation to the coronavirus situation. So our aims for the session for the next hour is to raise awareness about the extent of loss and bereavement in children's lives, in particular relating to coronavirus. And we're going to extend our understanding of loss, you know, in very broader sense, beyond bereavement, into all the different things that are lost in the current situation. We're going to consider the grieving process, and we're going to present you with some psychological models of grief. We're going to talk in particular about the developmental nature of children's responses to death and how they understand and respond to the concept of death at different ages. And hopefully by the end of the session, you're going to feel more confident in supporting bereaved youngsters. Or if you already are very confident, but you had some questions about how this relates to the current situation, you'll feel reassured. So I'm going to start with a very important message after yourselves. We're talking about supporting children and adults who have gone through the loss and bereavement process in response to coronavirus. Now, even myself, Katie, and all of you have also gone through this experience, and we're talking really about a community experience which has been traumatic and confusing for everybody. So please keep that in mind and look after yourself during this session and also in the following work that you're going to be doing. I've put a little love heart on this slide, and on every slide you'll see the love heart on the bottom corner, and this is just a gentle reminder. Okay, so we've got somebody sharing one of their screens, so apologies for this. Whoever has just joined and shared their screen, please could you stop sharing, and I'm going to go back to my presentation. Don't worry, you just pressed the wrong button. So hopefully you'll be getting back our slides shortly. So as I was saying, it's really important to look after yourself in this session. And we've got that gentle reminder of the little love heart on every slide as we go through. You might have come to this session today expecting what the content would be or having a bit of a rough idea. And you will be aware that the concept of loss, bereavement and change is always a sensitive issue. But there may be things that come up in the session that are unexpected, or you have an unexpected reaction to them. So that's okay. Just check in with yourself. If you need to leave the session and take a moment and come back, that's fine. And if you need to follow up with anybody after the session, if things have resonated with you, please make sure to do so. So keep in touch with your support systems around you, whether it's your colleagues or your family and friends. If there's anything that you want to follow up with us in the Educational Psychology Service, please do so. Even immediately after this session, please email us, and we're going to give you our contact details at the end of the session. We'll also give you a range of different charities and organisations that you can get in touch with if you or someone that you're going to be supporting needs some follow-up support, so please do so. At the moment, the Educational Psychology Service is having a sort of county-wide critical incident response service. So that means you can get follow-up support through your Link Educational Psychologist if there's any particular loss and bereavement issues in your school community at the moment. So if you know who your Link Psychologist is, you can get in touch with them. If you don't know who it is, we'll give you our general email contact at the end, and you can email us. In terms of engagement and confidentiality, please feel welcome to engage as much as you want. So if you want to talk to us on the chat and share ideas and questions, please do so. Please make sure to maintain confidentiality with a large group, so don't name any schools or names where children would be identifiable. But also feel free to just sit back and listen and take in the content. That's absolutely fine. Okay. So all of the resources that we're talking about today, including the slides from this presentation, are shared on our training website. So as soon as you log off, you can go and download everything for free. And they're freely accessible. So you can share the link for this website with anyone in your school. So if you're thinking, oh, I'll go on the training, And then I'm going to be sharing the resources with other people in my school or even with parents and carers. That's absolutely fine. You can send it to them. They won't need to log in or anything. They can get the resources. So this is the link to our resource website. Now you will have this in the invitation where you got the Microsoft Teams invitation as well. So if you log off and you can't remember the link, it'll be in that invitation. We've set up a new section on the website, in particular in relation to coronavirus. We've got sort of 4 key areas. So we've got loads of resources on guidance for speaking to and supporting children and young people around coronavirus. And we have today a range of people all the way from early years to secondary and people from alternative provision and special school. So there's a range of resources on there for younger children, for children with additional needs. There's some great stuff from MenCap, and for secondary school children, there's some really good stuff from Young Minds, which is online content that teenagers can read for themselves and access. So we're aware that some of you in schools are working on a rota basis at the minute, and you're in school sometimes and sometimes working from home. So if you or any of your staff are looking for CPD, we have some recommendations of online learning courses for staff. We also have a new section, which is about coronavirus, the road to recovery. Today, as part of that, we're starting to think about returning to school. And I know some of you will have, some infant classes in already if they're not coming in the next few days. One of the things we have written is a therapeutic story called The Little Elf Who Missed His Birthday Party. And this is a story which helps primary age children explore the strong emotions they're having at the moment in reaction to opportunities and things that they're missing out on. And that might be something that we're going to talk about shortly. And most importantly, I think at the moment, is the section we have on supporting adult well-being, because we are all going through this process as well. It's really important that we're looking after ourselves and also the other adults that are going to be working with children. So we've got some really helpful resources around supporting adult well-being. Okay, so I'd like to get started with the content by prompting you to reflect on the concept of change. Every time life changes, something is lost. And each of us, children and adults, will experience change in a unique way. So what I want you to do is to broaden out your concept of loss and change beyond, the very acute experience of bereavement into all the changes and experience of loss that we might experience. So, for example, moving to secondary school is an example of a major change and often a significant loss for some young people. So when we talk about change, change is part of human life, but there's always some element of loss. And what we find is that there's a continuum in terms of the severity of the impact of loss. So for some children, moving to secondary school, they might feel a bit sad about the things they've lost, but they're excited. Whereas other children might experience, a really severe grief and loss reaction when they move to secondary school. So I'd like you to think about this question. I'd like you to consider all the different types of loss that children and young people will face linked to coronavirus. I'd like you to take a few seconds to think and start to share some ideas on the chat. And I'm going to hand over to Katie, who's going to share some of the common themes that are coming through. If you can see the chat, you'll be able to see what everyone's saying. But if not, Katie's going to be sharing some of those themes. So handing over to you, Katie.
Okay, Sally said friendships, Teresa friendships, Rebecca loss of friends and family, Louise routine, Lauren said social interaction, Lisa again routine, Ali school life, confidence, loss of contact with others, loss of certainty, teachers and learning, structure of school, security, freedom and choice. Yes, independence away from family, safe place for someone, for some, seeing family, hobbies, control, someone else has said control, loss of routine, socializing, control, suicide, consistent behavior management. Yes, yeah. Yeah, so these are all examples of the loss that's wider, that's happening at the moment. Death of family. Yeah.
And I guess it's quite powerful, actually, the things that are being shared, the, very small day-to-day losses that might be, feeling very big for some children. And then also the significant examples, like Lisa's sharing, where you're talking about, specific bereavement.
Yeah. Okay, we've got a few more ideas. So the loss of role models, yeah, that's a good one, Rebecca. So Lucy says security, unconditional regard, sensory input, physical contact, yes, independence. Year 6 may have much time left at school, so that is that rite of passage that they've lost. Sense of purpose, celebrations missed, relationships with key workers, bond with the teacher, leaving school, year 11 not being able to say goodbye. So it's not just us as adults that we've lost kind of the rites of passage, but the children too. Teacher bond with the children. SATs for year 6, mixed blessing indeed.
Mixed blessing, yeah. Oh, hi, Sally.
Sense of belonging, so being part of a school, sports teams. We were talking about this yesterday, actually. Swimming lessons, freedom, the opportunity to show their learning in exams and maths. So they've worked so hard to get to that point, and then not being able to follow that through.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody, for engaging with the chat and sharing your ideas.
Oh, yes. Sorry, one more. Birthdays and celebrations.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. Okay.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to move us on to the next slide, which shows us a list of common areas of loss. And this comes from our universal knowledge about the process of loss and bereavement. But I can see so many of the things that you've been observing and noticing recommended or suggested and echoed here. So familiar environments and significant adults, and importantly, separation from significant adults, not just through bereavement, but actually from physical separation. So, not seeing teachers or TAs or your favourite adult around school. Friendships, a key theme that I think has come up almost, first in all of the chats in these webinars that we've done, a really strong thing. And then, unfortunately, some children and adults experiencing the very, acute experience of death of a loved one. Okay, so we're going to have a think about how we understand what is going on psychologically when people are experiencing these losses. And remember, we have that continuum. So there is some research that tells us that up to 20% of people don't have a grief reaction when they experience bereavement and loss. And that's quite important to remember, I think, because the first point here in terms of our principles is that grief is a normal reaction to loss, but also remembering that some people might not be grieving. And particularly for children, I've certainly supported young people where they might not be experiencing grief in response to something that people might expect them to, and worrying about, are they weird? Is there something going on? Equally, there might be children who look like they're not grieving, but there might be more subtle signs that they are not coping very well, and we'll talk about that a bit later. So what we know about understanding grief is that there are no hard and fast principles that can tell us exactly what to do and exactly what to say in every situation. However, we do have these evidence-based guiding principles, which are really powerful. And anytime, I certainly know myself, and I don't know about you, Katie, if you would agree, that in my practice in this area, anytime I get stuck and I don't know what to say or do, I go back to these principles. I check if what I'm doing matches up to these principles. And if it does, then I know I'm going in the right direction, I'm doing the right thing. So these core principles are, thanks, Katie. These core principles are really key when it comes to understanding grief. So the first is that grief is a normal reaction to loss. And particularly in the initial days and maybe weeks in response to a sudden or very stressing loss or bereavement, all behaviours might be expected, because what we're seeing is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation, which is causing distress. The second point is really key, that most young people do not need grief counselling. That would be formal grief counselling with a psychologist, but they do need support. And the evidence tells us that informed support from close friends, family and school staff can be really supportive and helpful for children and young people. We also know that there is some evidence that professionals jumping in too soon before the natural support systems have had time to set in can cause a risk of re-traumatization. So actually, it's really important in the immediate aftermath of traumatic experiences to start with the natural support systems around a child or an adult, family, friends, school staff, and then to help find a way through those natural support systems. And most young people will be able to grieve in a healthy way with that support. There will be some people that might need ongoing support, and we'll talk about that as we move through the session. The third point is really key. Young people and children are active in constructing their recovery from loss. So if we don't listen to them and talk to them, if we hide things from them, it's not that they will just sit there passively. We know that they will ask questions, they will seek information, they will try and figure out what's going on for themselves. And if they come across an inaccurate source of information, whether that's from a young friend or online or something they misunderstand, that can cause confusion and distress. So it's really important that we actively engage with young people who are experiencing loss. We give them the right information at the right time, and we help them to construct their recovery in an active way. Experience of loss is so unique, so we really must try and understand what's going on for that individual young person or that adult. We also know that knowledge about loss and bereavement is empowering for the natural support systems. So, for example, what you're doing today, learning about loss and bereavement or reminding yourself about the psychology of loss and bereavement, will empower you to be an effective support system for the children or adults that you're going to be working with. And finally, a key idea is that if we get the support right, the thing we're aiming for is healthy grieving. So we're not trying to prevent grieving or to stop children from grieving, because actually grief is a normal human reaction to loss. But what we are aiming for is healthy grieving, where children are talking and sharing and constructing and understanding what's going on. So that's what we're aiming for. So these guiding principles are really key. And whenever you get confused or lost in this area, which is sensitive and it can be difficult, our advice is to return to these principles and check what you're doing against these. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to share with you in more detail from those principles is some psychological models of grief. And now the first one I'm going to share with you actually has been critiqued, and we would consider it out of date. But the reason I'm going to share it with you is because it's very well known. And if you have done some work or reading or training around the grief process, you might be familiar with this, the linear model of grief. So the linear model says that when we experience grief, we go through these 4 stages in a linear way, a bit like a checklist. You go through one stage, you move on to the next. Initially shock, then protest, then despair, and then acceptance. So this model was initially critiqued by some researchers in Norway. And the main critique they made was that this model came from a piece of research that involved adults who are accepting a diagnosis of a terminal illness. Now, this model was meaningful for them and it made sense about what was going on for them, and it was really helpful. But the mistake that we've all made is overgeneralizing this to everybody who goes through any sort of grief. And actually, this is a very specific experience. It's not the same for everybody. And the main problem with this is if we go into acceptance and we move on, this model doesn't allow for difficulties in going back and thinking about the person or wanting to reconnect with them, even though you've moved on. And also that question about, is the person stuck if they're still thinking about the person who has died? So a wonderful psychologist called Michael White has talked about this model, about the mistake that this model makes is saying goodbye too well and saying that we have to cut all ties with the person or the thing that is lost. And actually what Michael White says we need to do is we need to say hello again to the new person or the new thing in the new world that exists without them. And we need to think about the things that we like about the person who has died, or the things about us that we have learned from that person that we want to take forward with us into the new version of the world where that person is missing. And so in response to the critique of the linear model, what we have now is the dual process model of coping with loss. So if you can see it on the slide, the first thing you'll notice is that it's much more messy and dynamic. And that is more like the real human experience of grief. The human experience is messy. We psychologists like to try and put it into checklists and flowcharts and diagrams, but in the real world, it's messy and dynamic. So what this model says is, our everyday experiences of life in response to loss can be categorized into 2 groups. One is loss orientated. An example might be grief work. It doesn't have to be formal grief work. It's any work that we do to understand our grief. It could be talking to a friend or talking to a parent and working through the feelings and trying to understand what those feelings are. The other category of the activities is restoration orientated. This is about attending to life's changes, doing new things. The dual process model tells us that we don't have to move in a linear fashion from one to the other. It's more like a zigzag. We can move over and back between the two. We could be initially focusing on some loss orientated work. Then we might move to doing new things and being distracted. But then one day we might be doing the washing up after dinner and we get this intrusion of grief feelings and we get moved back into loss orientated. And this model helps us to know that that's okay, that moving back and forth. Katie, when we did a webinar last week, she helpfully noticed that sometimes anniversaries can be a trigger for moving back into loss orientated work. So even, you know, up to 10-year anniversaries sometimes can bring people back to the loss orientated work and we can feel that grief again. And that's okay, because this dynamic model shows how people can in a healthy way move back into the restoration orientated. So this model is a lot more meaningful and people sort of connect with this a lot more when they talk about their experiences of loss and bereavement. The next model, which is similar but slightly different, focusing a bit more on the emotions, is the upward spiral of grief model. So this model says that in the immediate aftermath of a bereavement or loss, we start in a very dark place of grief and we start to spiral around a range of different emotions, including sadness, anger, guilt, fear, shock, and maybe even happiness. We go around this spiral increasingly, and the more we go around through the spiral of emotions, the lighter it becomes, eventually working towards adjustment. Okay, and so that's not necessarily moving on. It's just adjusting to the new world without the thing or the person that you have lost. Across this model, you'll see this idea of confusion. So for everybody, but particularly for children or for adults with learning difficulties, these contrasting emotions can be really confusing within the spiral. So for example, we might have a young child who's someone in the family has died, and they're feeling happy one day because maybe they have their favorite sandwich for lunch. And then they might start to feel a bit guilty because why are they feeling happy when someone has just died? So this spiral model can be really helpful around that, noticing the spiral of emotions is okay, but also noticing that it can be scary and confusing. So we might need to offer some support for people who are going through this. So at this point, having shared these grieving models, I'm just going to check in with Katie, really, if any key questions that have come through the chat we need to think about. Oh, Katie, I've muted you. I do apologise.
It's okay. You can do that. Ola, it's fine. No questions as such. Daniel just said that when you were talking about children, if we as adults don't provide the support that they need, and if we don't engage with them and we hide things from them, they might become vulnerable to radicalisation and I guess vulnerable on the whole.
Absolutely, it's a really good point, yeah. And it's about talking to children and not worrying about saying the wrong thing or not knowing what to say. And it's okay to say to a child even, I don't know what to say to you, but I am here for you. And we're going to talk about some scripts like that. But definitely talking and listening to children is the most protective thing we can do to, you know, work against that vulnerability. Brilliant. Okay.
Can I just interject there?
Yes,
Paula?
Katie.
I guess I've talked to a number of people as adults that when they've experienced grief, often adults will avoid having conversations because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing.
Yeah.
I've one of my family members talked about someone crossing the street so that they didn't have to talk to them after that their mum passed away. And I guess it's reminding yourself that it's unlikely that you'll say the wrong thing. It's more important that you listen and engage with that person and acknowledge their grief. But sometimes our natural response is to try and avoid that because we're scared.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I can see a question coming in from Michaela. We're going to talk about sharing information shortly. It's a really good question about, you know, what if too much information is shared? We're going to come on to that. So what I'd like to do is, before we move on to thinking about what to do, I would like to spend a bit more time in the understanding what's going on, because exactly like Katie said, it's, you know, you will know what to say and you will know how to support children. And when we share with you the strategies, you will see how simple they are. The powerful thing about it is spending some time understanding what's happening for the child in terms of the grief model and some of these changes in behaviour, helping you to spot what's going on. Because the key thing is about talking at the right time in the right way, using the right language. And we're going to talk a bit about that. So I'd like to invite you to share some more ideas about that in response to the question here. What sort of changes might you see in behaviour, or have you seen in children you've supported in the past, in bereaved youngsters? And I am aware at the moment you might not physically be seeing the children, so you might just be hearing about changes in your phone calls or video calls with parents or with other colleagues. So take a couple of seconds and then start to share with us some changes in behaviour that you might expect for children experiencing bereavement or loss in response to any of these things we've talked about. And Katie's going to pick up on some of these in the chat.
Okay, so we've got behaviour, lashing out at loved ones and friends, anxiety, being withdrawn, confusion. Children can become distant and withdrawn, unfocused and daydreaming. Attention seeking, much quieter and withdrawn, being quiet and withdrawn. Sneaky or attention seeking behaviour, anger, reverting back to baby talk. Yes, yeah. Anger, acting withdrawn, breaking ties with key workers, eating less, eating more, sleeping less, drug use, biting, hitting out in temper, becoming withdrawn from things that they would normally do, physical aggression, anger, need for a comfort toy, anger and aggression, overly smiley, overcompensating, uninterested, denial, comfort eating to excess, hopelessness, erratic, withdrawn, tearful, social distancing themselves from everyone around them, food issues. Oh gosh, people are really contributing. Thank you. Sometimes there's no changes at the start. Yes, Teresa. Yes, you're right. Clinging to other relatives, separation anxiety, loss of interest in activities. Some can be happy to support depending on the family background and the support that's given. Becoming more social. Tell me if you need to move on, Orla.
There's lots of ideas there. I guess what's being reflected, which is really helpful, is the broad range of behaviours that we might see in response to loss. So what we've done so far is we've really broadened out our definition of loss, and as a result of that, we're broadening out all the behaviours that we might see. So the unique nature of children and adults' response to loss is really coming across in the things that you are sharing with us. Thank you very much. And lots of the things that you have picked up on and you have seen in your professional practice are reflected in these list of possible behaviour changes that we usually share when we talk about loss and bereavement. Now, this is by no means an exhaustive list, and there's lots of things that you have all seen that aren't on here. But in particular, I'd like to focus in, because we had a question from someone before the seminars where they asked us to talk about this. What if someone is not showing any particular signs of bereavement, but you're worried that they might not be coping? And so there are some more subtle things to think about, in particular, some of these physical difficulties and psychosomatic issues like headaches and stomach aches. So a child or even an adult might not be noticing, might not be making the link between them feeling a stomach ache or headache to the grief and loss. So that might be something to be more subtle. And I think someone picked up on the chat, an impact on schoolwork. So reduced concentration and attainment. And this, again, might be quite subtle. And this obviously is difficult to notice in the current situation, but there might be things that parents and carers are noticing when they're working at home with children. So these possible behaviour changes might be helpful to share with parents and carers, but also to notice that there might be no change. And that might be because a child is going through healthy grieving and they might not be showing their grief in particular situations. So we had someone talking yesterday where there might be lots of behaviour changes at home, but nothing at school. And that might be a reflection of healthy grieving. And also there might be, this small percentage of people who don't experience grief reactions in response to loss. So really that broad range of behaviours is to be expected. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to think about, in particular, developmental thinking and different developmental thinking at different ages. So on the website that you booked onto the webinar today, there's a link to the Educational Psychology Service Loss and Bereavement document. So everything we're talking about today is in there in much more detail, but I would like to focus on this section in detail. There's also an early years version. And for some of you who are working in some of our special schools with children who might be early years developmentally, you might like to have a look at the early years version, even if you're working with teenagers. Okay, so I'd like to have a think then about children's different responses to loss and death, which reflect the different levels of developmental thinking. So we know that developmental thinking impacts on how we understand death and how we can start to reconstruct our recovery in response to death. So, for example, for babies, we know they're very attuned to their parents' emotional state. So in the current situation, very understandably, a lot of parents would be feeling a little bit stressed or emotional. And if they're experiencing loss or bereavement, they might be experiencing a grief response as well. So in the immediate few days, a baby might be a bit unsettled, reflecting the emotional state of the parents. For toddlers, we find that they don't understand yet the finality of death. And so they might ask some very blunt questions like, when is grandma coming back? And that can be quite difficult for the adults around them because they themselves are trying to deal with the loss themselves. So it's helpful to understand that toddlers are not trying to be hurtful in asking the same question over and over again, but actually developmentally, they will really struggle to understand that death is final. In toddlers, we might also see egocentric thinking. If many of you have toddlers or work with toddlers, you'll see this every day. Everything is focused on themselves. But when it comes to death, they might also think that they have done something to make the person who has died go away. So they might think that they have been naughty and that's why the person has left. So if they're really good, the person might come back. As they get a little bit older, we might then see magical thinking, roughly in the ages 3 to 7. Now, all of these ages are approximate, just to give you a guide. And I would like to say that you need to keep in mind some of our children whose chronological age is not the same as their developmental age. So for those of you in special schools or those of you working with children in mainstream schools who have special educational needs, although they might be chronologically older, you might like to think about their emotional or developmental age if they're experiencing loss and bereavement. So when we see magical thinking, we might see children thinking that there's magical things they can do to make the person come back, or there's magical reasons that they've gone away. Okay, from the ages of 7 to 11, we can see concrete thinking developing, but also we're limited to concrete thinking. So that's sort of black and white, very logical thinking. So an example might be difficulty understanding sort of descriptive linguistic talk about death. So for example, if we said things like, we've lost your sister, or grandma has gone to sleep, a child might take that very literally. And that might be quite distressing because they might think that they can go out and find their sister or that grandma will wake up eventually. So it's quite important in that concrete thinking stage to be quite clear. And that can be hard as well for the adults around the child, but it's quite important to say things like, grandma has died. So there's no opportunity for confusion. Then finally, it's from, in typically developing children, from the age 11 onwards, that we would find the start of an adult type understanding of death. And that is about understanding the finality of death, understanding the spiritual nature and the concept of spiritual thinking about death, and also the impact on their own mortality. They can start to understand that a bit more. For younger children, for toddlers, I forgot to mention that because they don't really have the abstract thinking yet, the concept of death can be quite scary. And particularly in the current situation, it might be the first time some younger children have come across the concept of death, because they might be hearing about death on the news, or they might be hearing adults in their household talking about death a lot more than they would usually do. And they can be quite afraid that they're going to die. So they might need a lot of reassurance about that. Okay, so I think a question has come in from Julie. So is it advisable to explain to the child that they are behaving because they are grieving? Yeah, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be talking about how to talk with people. And definitely, I think it would be worth wondering aloud with the child and actually asking questions like, I wonder if you're feeling like this. I wonder if this is happening to you. We're going to talk a bit more about that. So definitely, I think, Katie's nodding, so I think I'm on the right track with my response there. Definitely worth exploring that with it. But the mistake we could potentially make is interpreting the child's behaviour and telling them that it's like that, because actually they could be thinking about something else. So I think definitely introduce the idea, but ask it as a question rather than saying, you need to understand you're behaving like this because of your grief. Katie, would you have anything to come in on there? Would you agree?
I agree with you. I was just reflecting, because I guess they may be behaving that way because of their grief, but equally they might also be wanting that biscuit for breakfast at that point in time. So it's very tricky. I guess it depends on the level of development and their chronological age.
Absolutely.
It would depend on the context and the individual, the child, if you want to make that link or not.
Yes. And I think that's the answer to Eleanor's question as well. And I'm gonna move us along, because we're going to talk about something called the Goldilocks principle, which is a really useful principle when responding to how much information we give children. So one of the things to think about in terms of how much we give children, and something that's coming up, is a challenge of you as a member of school staff thinking about how much information to give children, but also the family might be doing things differently. And it is quite important to respect families' wishes, but we recognise there can be a tension there. So some factors to think about. We've talked a lot about age and developmental thinking skills, but also think about language skills, because you might be working with children who don't have language as communication. So we might need to think about pictures, sensory experiences that we can use to help them to understand based on their developmental level. The quality of support is really important, and we do know that if we have high quality support for children and young people, they can experience healthy grieving. Strong attachment relationships is another key protective factor for children's grief, and that can be attachment relationships in the family, but also in the school and the community. Okay. And the information available, you guys have picked up on that in your questions. It is really key, and we're going to talk a bit about that. So I'm conscious of the time, and I'm going to keep going, but I think we might run over maybe by about 5 minutes, because we didn't start till a little bit about 5 past. So if you do need to leave at 11, please do, but please stay on if you have any other questions as well. We're going to think about what we can do to help. You will see the things we can do to help are really simple, but they are powerful and they are hard. And I guess what I would say is, don't underestimate how hard these things are, particularly in the current context, because everybody in the world has experienced the coronavirus situation as a community. And so the things that we're talking about that will be affecting children will also be affecting us. So the first advice is to keep routines as much as possible. That is really hard in the current situation, because most daily routine has gone completely out the window. But what we do know is that any small bit of familiar routine can offer some comfort. So we might not be able to make everybody feel better and get things back to the way they were as quickly as we would like. But a lovely example from one of the webinars last week was a family having breakfast together every morning at the same time at the kitchen table, same time as they would do when they were going to school. And although the rest of the day might be chaos and homeschooling might just be a disaster that day, that little bit of familiar routine was helping to settle the children in the morning and, a little bit of comfort. The second one is be calm and consistent. Easier said than done, as we all know. However, really important in the current situation to watch out for times when we just know that we won't be able to be calm and consistent, and to draw on our support networks. So whether that's other colleagues, other people in the family, if there's things where you're saying, I'm really struggling to be calm and consistent today, to check in and to tag team the support around children. The third one I think really should be at the top: listen. So there's some research which was done by a Welsh psychologist where he worked with children and asked them what they found helpful about loads of different psychological therapies, lots of different models, different types. The one thing they said for all of the different types of therapies was that they felt listened to. That was the best thing about it. So actually, if we can help children feel listened to, that will really help them. And notice that in listening, we don't need to be worrying about the right thing to say. We just need to listen to the child and make them feel heard. Be prepared is really important. So think about the content that you're learning today, and particularly those developmental levels, before you talk to or support the children and young people that might be going through loss and bereavement. And prepare yourself for some of the questions they might ask, some of the activities that might be helpful for them. We're going to share with you a load of activities for you to look at the end of the session. So spend some time preparing, and actually that can be really helpful, particularly for some blunt questions that might come up that could be quite shocking and upsetting for you as an adult, but they might just be completely reflective of the developmental age that the child is at. And most importantly, look after yourselves. Now, if you're going to be sharing these resources and ideas with other colleagues in your school or with parents and carers, please make sure to really emphasize that fifth point. The adults need to look after yourselves when you're doing this work. And there's some key resources around that we're going to share. Okay. We're going to share with you this key message about resilience. You can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. So there are so many waves in relation to the coronavirus situation that we cannot stop. And part of helping healthy grieving is recognizing and accepting the things that we can't stop, and worrying a little bit less about those, but focusing on where are the opportunities for teaching surfing skills? What are the things we can do? So we're going to share with you a range of resources. You will recognize, if you've done work in this area, if you were an ELSA, a lot of these loss and bereavement resources, which are still relevant, probably more relevant in the current situation, but there are some specific resources relating to the coronavirus situation that we are going to share. So we really recommend a charity called Winston's Wish. Their tagline is "Giving Hope to Grieving Children." They offer loss and bereavement support for children. They have fantastic resources on their website, and they have a national helpline where anybody can phone up and ask for advice on how to support a grieving child. Now, some of you in your schools and your organisations might have worked with them, and Pippa, who's a psychologist from my team who's here today, I know she has done a lot of work in this area and linked with Winston's Wish, phoned them up, asked them for advice when she's had really complex situations and she's wanted some advice, and found them really useful. So we can't recommend them enough. They've got some helpful articles at the moment on their website. One is about talking to children about coronavirus. Their three key pieces of advice are: first, acknowledge what's going on for the child, acknowledge their feelings, their thoughts, acknowledge what they're saying. Reassure them as much as you can, recognizing there are some waves that we can't reassure them about, but think about the things we can reassure them. So telling them about the reasons that we're staying at home, the reasons that we're washing our hands are to keep ourselves safe. Telling them about, for example, if there's a grandparent that they can't see, we're doing that to keep ourselves safe. And finally, talk to them about coronavirus. So do talk to children about coronavirus and explain why the world looks so strange and different at the moment. And as I said at the start of the webinar, we have resources on our website that we've gathered from a range of areas that are really helpful for different ages to help adults talking to children about coronavirus. So this slide, I would say, is very similar to the guiding principle slide at the start. Responding to questions is a challenge that faces us as adults, particularly working with children experiencing bereavement. And I would say in my work with schools and parents and carers who are supporting grieving children, this is probably one of the most common questions that I get from the adults. How do I respond to particular questions? So again, there's no hard and fast rule about what to say in every situation. However, there are these guiding principles for responding to questions. And certainly in my experience, and Katie might be the same, I don't know, when I've not known what to say or I've not known the answer to a question, I've come back to these principles and these have always helped me. So the first is, don't brush them aside. So if a child asks a question, don't say, it's not okay to ask questions, that's a silly question, anything like that, maybe later, and then we don't get to it. No matter how hard it might be for the adults, don't brush the questions aside. And if it is too hard for you to answer that question, try and find another adult who can answer the question or who can listen at the very least. Apply the Goldilocks principle. Now, yesterday in the webinar, my colleague who was with me, Zoe, was reflecting that whenever she thinks about this Goldilocks principle, she thinks it can't be that simple, can it? But it really can. The Goldilocks principle says, in terms of how much information we should share with children, just enough, not too much and not too little. And how do we know? The answers are the grief models of loss and the developmental thinking ideas. And also, most importantly, your knowledge of the child and your relationship with the child. Okay, so we need to think about the situation that the child is in, their developmental thinking, and our knowledge about loss and bereavement. And that will help us to know that we must share some information, but not too much and not too little, just enough to help them to identify healthy grieving. Yes, and linking back to your question earlier, Eleanor, definitely. And so we might need to be thinking about if you're concerned about oversharing in the family environment, you might need to open up a conversation about that. If you're identifying that the child is distressed. The language is really important as well. It might be that there is a very difficult and traumatic and even sometimes violent death that the child will be aware of because it has happened, but we will think really carefully about the language that we will use, particularly relating to those developmental levels. If possible, try to avoid being shocked by blunt inquiry. So I know myself, I was at a family funeral when I was younger, and one of my very young cousins, when the coffin was being lowered into the grave, a very quiet moment, shouted out really loudly to her mum, "Is the dead guy in that box?" And that was obviously quite shocking and embarrassing and, really awkward. But that young child was just trying to figure out what was going on in this really unusual, strange situation and trying to figure out what was going on and what death meant. So although it's hard, I think that links back to that idea of being prepared that we said earlier. Expect blunt inquiry from particularly younger children and older children with additional needs who might developmentally be in that younger stage. And be sensitive to differing spiritual beliefs. When I've done this session for a group of Elsas, one of the Elsas shared this really nice script she used to explain differing spiritual beliefs to children. And she said that other families might have different stories about death that they believe, and they might do different things. And that's important for them. Your family might be different, but it's important to understand that they have a different story that's important to them. So the circles of support model is really powerful as well to think about what we should do. In terms of circles of support, this is also called the onion model. And it says that the person experiencing loss and bereavement is in the middle of the circle. And then each layer out is the family, the friends, the teachers and other professionals who are different levels of distance in terms of their relationship to the person who's bereaved. The model tells us that each layer should support the layer one step in from them. And I've certainly found this really helpful in my personal and professional life. If I've had a friend or a family member who's experienced bereavement and I've not known what to do, I felt like, there's not really anything I can do that might be helpful. And especially in the current situation, you might not be able to offer direct support to the children and young people because, it might not physically be seeing them at the moment. So there might be things that you as teachers and other professionals can do to talk to and support the parents and give them information and guidance. And maybe if you're working with older children, you might even be talking to some of the friends of a child or young person who's bereaved, sharing with them information and ideas. Okay. So the next list of questions, we're not going to do it as a group because we don't think that this format really will capture the richness of it. But what we'd like to advise is that you take these questions back to your school or your organisation and discuss them as a group with your colleagues. Some really important questions in whatever format you're your conversations are taking place at the moment, and ask yourselves, what can your school do to help a young person experiencing loss? And, you know, everyone in your school will be going through that in some way. What part could you play? And think about all the different roles in schools and what the different people can play, what roles the different people can play. And also think about what areas of the curriculum could be used to explore loss. And so what we're going to do is we're going to share some ideas, curriculum resources. And after this training, if you go onto our website, you will see all of those resources on there, and you can pick out the ones that are relevant for you, whether you're in early years or secondary or a special school provision or alternative provision. So some nice ideas here and activities about helping youngsters express grief. And lots of you will recognise having done these before. And also we would recommend the Winston's Wish website, which has lots of other activities which are really useful. And what's really important here is going back to that point that youngsters are active in experiencing their grief, and actually asking children what they would like to do and asking them to come up with their own ideas for activities can be really powerful. So I've certainly had experience working on critical instance where there's been a death of a student in schools, which has been really difficult. But some of the ideas that the other pupils have come up with around memorials and things like that have been really wonderful. On Winston's Wish website, there's some really useful information about how to say goodbye when a funeral isn't possible. The arrangements for funerals are changing on a daily basis. So they have a link to the National Advice Hotline. And this does come up as a very practical question. I guess it's important to say that as a school, we're not in any way saying that you should be responsible for making the decision about whether children should attend a funeral, and it should be the family's decision and responsibility. But you might have parents asking you for advice, and we would say definitely guide them to the Winston's Wish website. They have a wonderful quote here, which says, "We have spoken to children who chose to attend the funeral of someone important, and we're glad they did. We have spoken to children who chose not to attend and had no regrets. We have never spoken to a child who attended a funeral and wished they hadn't. But we have spoken to so very many who did not attend and deeply regret it." So I guess key in there in that powerful quote is involving the child and helping them to make a decision themselves about whether they want to go to the funeral. And in the current situation, it might be participating in a different way through video link. Okay, so I'm very quickly, conscious of the time, I'm very quickly going to share some advice about developing a recovery curriculum in the return to school. And we on our website, we're part of some multi-agency working around this, and there will be some guidance coming out in the school bulletins in the coming weeks, but we'll be updating our website after this with loads of different resources that are coming out. But a really helpful guidance is this article from a lady about Mary Meredith, 5 ways to help children heal when schools reopen. So 5 key ideas to recommend. The first is to have a remembrance event, to involve the whole school community and to get the community active in planning that. So asking your staff, asking the parents and the children ideas for what they might like to do. Place relationships front and centre and give everybody permission to do that. Identify and support the children most in need. And now, so think about the children who are most in need already because they have existing additional needs or vulnerabilities, but also the children who might have had particularly tricky times in the current situation because of what's ever been going on at home, or because they really need school as a protective factor and they haven't had that for a while. Spend some time reaffirming safety and routines and core values. What we find when people experience trauma, loss, bereavement and grief is that they can feel a little bit lost, a bit disconnected from their sense of belonging and identity, a bit sort of misfooted. So actually spending some time as a school reaffirming who we are, what it means to be part of this school, what's important to us, how we look after each other is really important in the return to school phase. Last week, we received a really amazing resource from the Behavioural Educational Psychology Service. So that's in Kensington and Chelsea. And they have developed a curriculum pack for transition, recovery and learning in the aftermath of the pandemic. We've uploaded these onto our website. We are developing more local versions of some of these activities, but this is a fantastic starting point. There's a primary version and a secondary version, so you can download whichever one is relevant to you. There might be some children who need additional support, ongoing support, whether this is in the immediate aftermath or, after 6 months or a year. And we had a question previously about when should we start to ask some of these questions about whether a child might need some extra support. Again, there's no hard and fast rule, there's no exact timeline, but we would have this guiding principle about consider the least intrusive intervention that might be effective. And if you're starting to have concerns about a child, who might not be coping well, these are some of the questions that you or parents and carers might ask. And so if parents or carers are saying to school, I'm a bit worried, you might want to check through some of these questions that you might want to ask about. In terms of a rough guide, we would say that in the initial 2 weeks after a sudden or unexpected loss or bereavement, that is the adjustment phase, and all manner of behaviours, will be expected. And we would check in after the first 2 weeks with some of these questions, and probably then check in again after about 6 months and after about a year. But also, the experience of grief is unique. So there might be children experiencing different timelines here. Ask yourselves these questions. And if you do think we need some extra support, we're going to go through now a range of support services and places where you can get further information. So you might want to get some support for the child. We would recommend the Children's Bereavement Centre in Newark, which was previously called Sue's Place. So some of you might have worked with them before. I noticed it says on the notes the child's parents could go to the GP, but I think at the minute they could probably phone the GP. A lot of GPs are not allowing physical visits. The child might be working with CAMHS, or you might want to refer to CAMHS if difficulties are, severe and persistent. You might want to link with an ELSA if you have an ELSA in your school, and the ELSAs have had specialist training on loss and bereavement within their ELSA course, so they might be able to do some work with a child or young person who's experiencing difficulties. So there's also some national hotlines that we would really recommend. The first is Winston's Wish, and the second is a charity called Cruise, who have lots of resources and advice available. So we would recommend them. And I know some of the schools that I work with have used Cruise when they've had students who've experienced bereavement. So some further websites with lots of information, and also very importantly, the Support for Adults links. And we would again ask you that if you're sharing these resources with parents, with other colleagues, please make sure to emphasize the support for adults. These last 3 slides are available to download as a separate PDF if you want to share them, put them on your school website or put them in any of your school newsletters. So on our website, we have resources around supporting adult wellbeing in response to coronavirus. We have the Samaritans, who have their website and their national free phone number. Please contact your Link EP, or if you don't know who that is or you don't have one, contact us, our general eps.admin address. If you want any follow-up after today's session, or if there's anything happening in your school community that you think you need some loss and bereavement support with. And also we would recommend for adults the charity Mind, who have, some really helpful online chat. It's worth saying that all these charities are, if you go onto their website, there's big messages saying we're open, come, welcome, please talk to us at the current time. Okay, so a whistle-stop tour there at the end, but we've got some key resources, and I think maybe people are looking for those resources there. I'll leave those sources of support up there for you. I'd like to take a moment to thank you for your engagement today. Thank you so much for taking part in the chat. If there is any questions we need to follow up on, we will do. Please feel free to share any reflections or feedback in the comments as you're leaving. And keep in mind that the ability to reflect and think about the impact of this work on you is a protective factor for your emotional well-being. So have a think about how you and your colleagues in school are going to be thinking about and reflecting on how you're doing, how it's impacting on you, who's okay, who's not okay, in staff meetings, in conversations. So thank you so much. It's been really nice to see everybody today. Please go and have a look on the website. You'll have the link in the invitation. Download the resources that are useful for you. And if you have any that you come across, send them to us. We'll have a look and we'll add them to our resource as well. Some of the ones that are on there have come from schools who've used them and found them useful. So thanks so much, everybody. Katie, I can see lots of people checking out on the chat, telling us that they found it useful, which is great.
It's fantastic. Yeah, thank you, everyone. It's so great how many people are here today. And I know I keep saying the same thing, but I'll say it again. This topic is very emotive, so please do seek support from your friends, family, from your support network. Keep talking. Thank you.
That's great. Oh, just noticing some familiar names as well, checking in,
Yes.
checking out. Nice to have seen you all virtually. It's really good to hear that schools are finding this useful. And do have a look at all the resources, particularly those recovery curriculum resources. There's loads of really great activities on there. If you're getting started in planning the return to school, whenever that may be. Okay.
Thank you.
So I'm going to stop recording now. Stop recording.